Before I left the city, and granted, this was now 8 years ago, so it's been a while, and textile waste has only increased across the US. But when I left New York City's sanitation, we were picking up 250,000 pounds a month of used clothing and home goods. So a massive amount of material that we were picking up
Hundreds of tons.
was 250,000 pounds a month. So that was 8 years ago. I think textile waste has only continued to increase since then. There's not an organization that's ready to really accept all of the fabric waste in the city if people weren't still sending it to landfill.
Textile waste is a huge problem, as we all know. Sort of the reason behind why we're even talking about this in the first place. On average, in New York City, it's around 6% of the total city's waste stream, and it's actually the fastest growing waste category in cities like New York. In New York City, specifically, a law that was been recently passed, if 10% or more of your business's waste is textiles, you are required by law to recycle it. Increasingly, legislation is requiring businesses to document and disclose their greenhouse gas inventory, meaning how much greenhouse gases your operations are emitting. And for fashion businesses and design houses, textile waste is a huge part of that. So how can companies reduce this component of their environmental impact? How can cities address this increasing waste stream that doesn't have efficient infrastructure to handle it? Now, unfortunately, most brands are not like Eileen Fisher or Patagonia and aren't prioritizing sustainability in their business models. The design and creation of these products inherently leaves a lot of textile waste, fabric scraps, samples, etc. This isn't even to consider the actual waste derived in the manufacturing of the garments at scale. So how can the problem of fabric scraps, samples, and other textiles that would otherwise flood municipal waste management infrastructure be tackled? Enter Fabscrap. Jessica Schreiber is the founder of Fabscrap, which was created to meet New York City's commercial textile recycling needs, creating a system and a pathway for textile waste to be properly recycled and made available for reuse. Think of all the textile scraps that are discarded from fashion houses in cities like New York, London, wherever, that would traditionally just go to landfill. Now, thanks to Fabscrap, those textiles can to either have a second life, being directed to smaller brands and designers for resale, or get sorted and sent to their appropriate recycling facilities. In this conversation, we speak to someone who comes from the public sector and understands waste management firsthand, who saw the negative impact that this growing waste stream has on our city's infrastructure. It's a real entrepreneur's journey that Jessica has been on. Fabscrap is a staple in the sustainable fashion space within New York City. I'm really excited to speak with her, and I hope you enjoy. Jessica, thank you so much again for your time talking to us at the Growing Green Ventures podcast. Before we jump into the conversation, I'd love for you to give our listeners a bit of an overview of who Jessica is and your background and what got you into this sort of sustainable fashion space in the beginning.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Jessica Schreiber. I'm the founder and CEO of Fabscrap. I've lived in New York City for 13 years now, going on 14. So I consider New York City home, but I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I grew up doing a lot of backpacking and hiking and camping with my family. So spending a lot of time outside and in the natural world, and just really appreciative of our planet and wanting to save that for future generations. And so in undergrad, I studied biological sciences and got very into sustainability and climate change. I added a second degree in education because I wanted to be able to teach people about climate change and make it meaningful. And then went to Columbia for grad school, where I studied climate science and communication through a degree called Climate and Society there. That's now part of their climate school, but I predated the actual climate school. But I'm glad to see it's like formalized.
Yeah.
And yeah, we're after Columbia, I started working at New York City Department of Sanitation, where I was running the city's clothing recycling program, and that is kind of what led me to Fabscrap. Fabscrap is now going on 8 years old, and yeah, it's been my baby for the last 8 years until last year when I had my actual daughter. And so now me and my husband live near the warehouse in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, with our daughter.
Amazing. I mean, for anyone that doesn't know, Fabscrap is a legend within the sustainable fashion space here in New York and beyond, as well as we'll get into further down the conversation. But yeah, Jessica, in your words, I'd love for you to articulate what Fabscrap is. What is your business model, and how does it support this larger transition into a circular economy for textiles and a sustainable fashion ecosystem?
Yeah. So Fabscrap is a nonprofit. We work primarily with the industry, the fashion industry, but we work with any industry with textile waste. So we also work with interior design, with the entertainment industry in New York City. And what we're doing is taking pre-consumer textile waste. So all of the fabric that's wasted in the design process,
Mm,
not what people typically think of, like used clothing, used home goods.
yeah.
This is all the waste that happens when those things are made. And
Hmm.
so mostly from design offices. Um, and then we sort it with volunteer help. And then we have fabric thrift stores. So we're really trying to redistribute as much of the unused fabric as we can and make it available to students and artists and crafters, home sewers, Etsy creators, etc. And so in a nutshell, I would say we're kind of B2B, a recycling service, and then
Mm,
B2C, a fabric thrift store. And I think where we are really integral in the supply chain is the same way that businesses pay for trash pickup or paper recycling, they
hmm.
pay for textile recycling with us. And I think it's a really important part of holding some of these bigger brands and companies accountable for their textile waste, having them internalize the cost of it and having it become a line item in their budget.
Hmm.
And then on the flip side, so much of this material now is available so that people can choose material that already exists instead of buying brand new virgin fabrics.
Totally.
Um, and so I think having that as an option when people are considering how they want to start their business, make their products, even just craft as a hobby,
Hmm.
has been really meaningful for people who want to have less impact on the planet.
Absolutely, absolutely. And for anyone who's listening in the New York City area and are interested in craft and interested in leveraging materials, I cannot recommend Fabscrap enough. I volunteered there a couple months ago and was able to pick up some amazing fabrics that are actually sitting next to me over here, waiting to turn into a shirt. TBD on how that goes out. Slash is now my kitchen table's cover or
Yeah.
whatnot, but it's a beautiful piece, and I'm really excited about that. Jessica, you mentioned something really interesting about sort of being a line item for their textile recycling. Just so that everyone's super clear about where you support and how you support along this value chain. You're sitting in post design, pre manufacturing, and addressing the waste basically that's created at that inflection point of the
Yes.
process.
Yes. So I think that's honestly a little bit overwhelming for people to understand,
Mm,
because when you come to Fabscrap and there's this mountain, like really a literal mountain, there's
a literal
probably
mountain, yes.
like we estimate that the pile of fabric that we need to sort through is 50 to 60,000 pounds. So a huge mountain of material in the warehouse. And then when we start to explain that that is just design waste, that is just creating the sample, that is just creating the initial piece that will be used to make an order, that's not the waste from the actual production of the order. So it's in that way where we're picking up 7,000 pounds a week right now from New York City design offices. If we were touching actual factories and production, I think we would be 10 to 20 times that, because really what we're seeing is just the design process of one piece. But when the companies that we work with order 100,000 units, order 200,000 units, all of that gets cut and there's waste in every piece of that process as well. So yeah, this is really just the waste between design and production.
What can you say about the specific challenge with the waste created at this stage? When I volunteered there, and this is for context for our listeners, a lot of the times we're sorting through fabric, literally fabric scraps or swatches that are really small, mixed material attached to paper, stapled to paper X, Y, and Z. Whereas the material at a manufacturer for finished goods has larger fabric that isn't sort of touched with this additional plastic and whatnot, even though half of it's already plastic. What are some of the unique challenges of addressing that type of waste and dealing with it in a responsible manner?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges is that um, brands aren't always like soliciting the amount of fabric swatches and fabric headers that they receive.
Mm-hmm.
So when mills create new fabrics, they will create these like 6 by 6 inch, 12 by 12 inch
Yeah.
cuts of the fabric, staple it to a piece of cardboard or a piece of paper that has all of their mill information, all of the fabric information, how you order, etc. And those are sent to their client contacts kind of indiscriminately. Brands may not even order those swatches or those headers. Usually
Mm,
they just send them out. This is a marketing piece. Like this is really marketing for the mills to say, hey, here's what's new this season. Have you seen it? Take a look. And so I think one of the challenges is that this is a marketing piece for mills. And so to really change the system, we're working on how do we reach mills to change the way that they're sharing their product with all of the brands that buy fabric. And so these headers move from mills to brands. Brands maybe choose a few of these swatches to keep and they become part of mood boards, etc. But then the rest go to the trash or they come to us. And what we found is of all of the material that we collect, and to date we're at like 1.72 million pounds, like a massive amount of material that we've collected. 75% of that are fabric swatches and headers. And so that's the part of the system that feels most broken to me. Um, I know that you want to touch the fabric, you want to see the fabric, you want to understand the feel, the drape, the color, etc. But it seems like there should be a better way. And so we've been kind of working on auditing the headers that we see. Last summer in August of 23, we did an audit. We audited 7,500 pounds of headers to kind of see like what's easiest to deconstruct. Is it headers that are taped, that are glued, that are stapled? Is it headers with lots of cardboard versus paper? And what we want to do is kind of rank the most common formats of these swatches that we see
mm-hmm.
and share that information with mills and say, like, if you can even just move towards this type of
Yeah.
packaging for your marketing materials, it would save so much
Mm-hmm.
labor and time and make your swatches more recyclable. So we're working on publishing that hopefully this summer because that's the piece that feels where the most innovation is needed, and we're hoping to work with our brand partners to reach the mills to do that.
Completely. Now, just for a larger picture, these mills that you're talking about, a lot of them are in Asia
Mhm.
and further down the line. Have you had challenges in the past or attempted to reach out to them in the past? And how has that communication been? Because I know there can be a bit
We
challenges in that. Yeah.
Yeah, we haven't worked with mills at all yet to date.
Mm-hmm.
The header audit is the first time that we've really thought about how we might need to connect with mills
Mm-hmm.
to see some waste reduction.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so we haven't attempted to connect with mills at all yet. I think when we make these recommendations, I think the way that we would go about it is through our brand partners. So
Mm-hmm.
the brands are recycling with us. And like I said, they're paying to recycle with us. So they're incentivized to also reduce this waste, to
Mm-hmm.
also have the mills send this in a different way or reduce their packaging or change the way that swatches are ordered. And so there's an incentive for brands to kind of connect us with the mills and have this be a three-way conversation to reduce waste from the source instead of
Mm-hmm.
just recycle it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love that. I think that that's such an important piece. A lot of the times when companies are going into sustainability or trying to redesign products and whatnot to be more sustainable, I think that the average consumer, the average person, the average stakeholder is not really thinking about the small things, but the small things add up. And these little swatches and the little glues and plastics and carpet that's attached to it is can be a forgotten piece of waste stream that needs to be addressed. I really
Yeah.
love what I'm hearing, but I'm curious, Jessica, what other ways do you think that the players next to you on this value chain can reduce their waste, specifically the manufacturers and the mills, as you said, and the brands and the design houses? How can that segment reduce their waste that they're creating?
Yeah, I think it's hard. Like I said, they're receiving a lot of these swatches
Hmm.
just kind of without asking for them. But I do think a lot of times brands over order.
Of course.
They want to see the universe before they select something.
Yeah.
And so I think the design process could be more thoughtful to how materials are used and how materials are created. Um, I think that is probably a really good question for my co-founder Camille Tagle. She worked in the fashion industry for years before joining Fabscrap with me,
Hmm.
and her background is fashion design, and she was seeing waste in the design process. She has a story that she told me where they spent months working on a collection, and a designer came in and said, I think we need to go in a different direction, and threw it all away.
Yeah.
Just threw it all away. So I think there's more respect needed in the materials and the supply chain
Hmm.
from the design piece. But, you know, I haven't really worked in the industry, so all of the considerations and the context for why choices like that are made. I'm sure
Yeah.
there's a million moving parts, but being at the end of life,
Hmm.
seeing like my whole career has been in waste management, seeing the waste from some of those decisions feels like there could have been more forethought at the beginning.
Mm.
Um, Particularly when I would love long term to see some extended producer responsibility, and that phrase is really meant that
Absolutely.
like so much about whether or not a product can be recycled when a consumer's done with it is actually a design decision.
Hmm.
Like I can't recycle something if the component parts can't be deconstructed, if the materials chosen that
Hmm.
to make it aren't recyclable. And so because so much of whether or not something at end of life can be recycled, I think there needs to be more responsibility on design and the material choice and the construction. So something to think about there is like a lot of time blends become harder to recycle. And there's a million performance reasons why designers might choose to work with a blend. But right now, where our recycling is at, that does make it a lot harder to recycle at end of life.
I love that you brought up the EPR component of this. To me, when looking at your business and I'm thinking about how it's kind of acting like a nonprofit EPR system. I'd love to know your take on EPR in general, extended producer responsibility within the textile space at large. Do you see hope that government will start to implement something of this nature? Do you think that there should be more regulation in this space, and that basically, effectively, like your business model should be co-opted by government institutions as an additional waste management system, or what can you speak to on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of EPR.
Yeah.
As a small tangent, when I was working at the Department of Sanitation, I saw EPR pass for electronics in New York
Mm,
City. And so that meant that electronics could no longer be put at the curb as trash. They had to be recycled,
mm,
which meant either sanitation picked them up in a separate collection or consumers needed to bring them to a new location for recycling. So
mhm.
what we saw was like Staples will take back electronics, Best Buy will take back
Cool.
electronics. There's drop off points throughout the city. And I was there when that rolled out in the city. And what's incredible is like in preparation, the city had started eCycle NYC so people could essentially have drop off locations in their apartment buildings.
Mhm.
And then they call a number and they would come get it for recycling. Um, Before EPR went into effect, about 300 buildings had signed up for that program. When EPR went into effect, we had 3,000 applications. And so the the amount of people who now cared enough, like before those 300 buildings kind of did it because they wanted to,
Mhm.
but then when you have to, then we see 3,000 buildings sign up. So I think that like EPR really does push people in the compliance piece.
Mhm.
And I think some of the interesting things that like need to be considered, especially if we were to do that for textiles, is who's going to take the material if it can't go to landfill, who is funding that program, because too often EPR shows up as a tax on consumers, and that defeats the purpose. It needs to be part of the
Mhm.
producer's responsibility to fund the program and like create the take back systems or create the recycling systems. So I think there's a lot to be learned from existing EPR legislation, that I
Mhm.
think this can be done in a way where it rolls out responsibly, where the volume is something that can be addressed appropriately, and it doesn't become an additional burden on the taxpayer.
Mm. Completely, completely. Um, Without going too far away from our earlier point, you said your co-founder comes from the fashion space and you
Mhm.
come from the waste management sector. What have you learned specifically about selling into or engaging and partnering with, rather, excuse me, with fashion houses? And what advice would you give for other sustainability or circularity players who are trying to work within this space?
One thing that's been really interesting for us is that
Mm.
signing up for Fabscrap almost always happens at like a design level position. It's not like C-suite who's like, our company is doing Fabscrap now. In
Okay.
some cases, we've even had interns who introduced it to
Really?
their boss, and then their boss was like, okay, this seems good, let's try it.
Hmm.
So it's really, I feel like one thing I've learned is that it's like it's grassroots within a company. It's people who really care about their work and care about their job and who are trying to do better and feel better about where they're working.
Yeah.
And so it's usually like it's the design team, it's the fabric team, it's an intern. It's almost never upper management or higher.
Interesting.
But then once we are working with a company, that's when I see sort of higher positions get involved, because they're
Yeah.
very into the data. They really want the metrics about what's getting recycled, what's getting reused, what does this mean for CO2 savings. The data becomes very valuable. And so
Hmm.
I think that's one thing that has been interesting, is seeing how that value has become um, more important to brands. We also, when we started, let brands choose whether or not we could publicly share that we work together. And it was about 50-50, brands who said we could use their name and brands who wanted to remain anonymous. Um, Now almost everybody opts in. Brands actually like rarely
Yeah.
opt out of, and I think there was a moment in that switch too when brands were like, well, how come I'm not on your website? And I was like, because you told us you didn't want us to mention you. So like I think they're also seeing
That's
a
funny.
consumer
Yeah.
value in sharing that they're trying to do better, that they're taking real tangible steps, that they're working with partners on sustainability.
Hmm.
So I think like if it's marketable, if there's data and there's numbers behind it, don't aim super high in the company. Aim with people who are making decisions about their job and their role. There's a real like employee engagement piece here.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I that's some of what I've learned with working with our bigger brands.
Interesting. Interesting. I mean, it just what you just said points to the fact that these companies now are really prioritizing their ESG initiatives, and obviously working with Fabscrap is a huge one in that. What about the money component about this? Like, right, because you said like this is a paid service that you're providing for these companies. I think they get the ethos of like let's save our waste, but when it comes to paying for that waste, has there been any challenges, or what have been the main pushbacks on that?
I think the main place where we try and do a little bit of education there is people will contact us and say we want to donate our fabric scraps, and we immediately change that verb to, oh, we're so happy you'd love to recycle with fab scrap. You're not donating.
Yeah,
The amount of material that we receive, and like I said, 75% of it are these small swatches that are not reusable.
yeah,
That's not a donation. Like textiles really do need to be seen as a waste stream, the way that we don't think we're donating a plastic bottle when we put it in a recycling bin. Like we're very clear that we're
yeah.
recycling that. And so I think these textiles need to be
Mm,
considered in the same way. So we really try and be mindful of the language that we use, that this is a recycling service.
yeah.
I think obviously our greatest competitor is landfill, because it's going to be cheaper to landfill something than to recycle it.
Mm,
But you can't market that you're sending something to landfill. you lose, like, even if you did have the numbers,
Yeah,
which I don't think you get the same kind of transparency
of course
when you
not.
throw
Yeah,
something away.
yeah, naturally.
You gain the transparency, but you also gain the ability to talk about what you're doing. And so there's a value there that I think is important.
Hmm.
But we really try and change the verb from donate to recycle because there's just in general a misconception that textiles are donated.
Totally, totally. No, that makes total sense. And I love that reframing of the conversation to really be more specific. Jessica, you mentioned something on a previous podcast that I was listening to that really intrigued me, and that was your discussion around being a nonprofit.
Hmm.
Being a nonprofit in this space, and your personal desire to or belief that addressing the environmental issues isn't really something that people should be profiting off of. I don't want to be putting words in your mouth, but the decision to stay a nonprofit and how that has either both benefited you or hindered you as you try to grow your impact. What can you say about staying a nonprofit, and the decision to formulate yourself as that?
Yeah. It's something that I get asked a lot. Um, when I when I originally pitched this business,
Yeah,
I pitched it as a for-profit, and I was pitching to a panel of investors on a TV show, as
which is
millennials
such a
do.
cool story. What was the TV show again for our listeners?
It was Project Runway Fashion
I
Startup.
love that. I love that.
Yeah, Project Runway tried to do like a Shark Tank spinoff.
That's so cool. They should redo that.
Only Well, it only lasted one season, so
Well,
it wasn't as
sustainability
popular.
is a different is you know it's a different breed now. Hopefully, then there more people will be
Yeah.
into it. You know.
But so when I was pitching this, I pitched it as a for-profit, and then investors said, like, we really think what you're doing, like, want to do is important.
Hmm.
But investors and sort of like launching a business with investment, they're looking for the quick return and like,
Hmm.
what's the return on this?
Hmm.
And even though pitched as a for-profit, and to date, almost every year we've been profitable. That profit
Nice.
margin is not enough that there's a huge return for investment.
Sure.
This isn't like the unicorn company. This is a very,
Yeah.
very slow burn with returns, but not returns where people I think are hoping to like make their money back and then some.
For sure.
Um, and so they encouraged me to go nonprofit, and those initial investments became donations instead.
Mhm.
So I think that there's a couple reasons why nonprofit resonated with me. And it's not necessarily that I think like across the board environmental work, like no individual should profit from environmental work.
Mhm.
I think I personally didn't feel the need to profit in addition to my paycheck at Fabscrap. Like, if this organization can pay me and
Mhm.
pay people, I think that was what I needed it to be able to do. Um, I didn't personally see the need for, like, if Fabscrap does super well for me to do super well, I want to see that go back into the business and continue to expand its reach, expand its mission. And that's really where nonprofit comes from, is just
Mhm.
like when the business does well, it doesn't mean nonprofit. I think there's a misconception that it means you can't make any money.
Totally. Totally.
Like, not the case. I don't even have to break even. Like, I can be profitable.
And
It's
you
just
are.
that
And you are.
most we have been. I mean, except for like COVID years and like last year we
Sure.
opened a new location. So like with some caveats, but in general, like yes. Um, but I think putting that back into the business to continue to grow the team, grow the mission, increase the impact, that's the definition of a nonprofit, and that works for us.
Mhm.
It also makes us eligible for grant funding, which I think is an important piece of what we're doing. It lets people contribute financially through donations, as like tax exempt donations to an organization. If they don't have fabric, need fabric, aren't in New York City and can't volunteer, they can make a donation, and it really does help us.
Mhm.
Um, and it also allows us to have volunteers. Like, if we were a for-profit company, we could not have volunteers. And I don't know that we would be able to get through as much material as we do without our volunteer team.
I just want to take a pause and just shout out you and your organization and the hard work you put in because, I think to your point, there's a lot of misconceptions around nonprofit, and there's a lot of the types of businesses that are being started and how they're being structured is uh, is interesting, and it's an important thing to know, especially when the objective is to reduce waste and sort of promote a more sustainable future. But a lot of companies just aren't profitable, and they aren't building a system that has strong good unit economics. And it sounds like you are, and that's really impressive and rare, to say the least, in this ecosystem of just like venture-backed startups that don't know how to make a profit at all. So kudos to you, Jessica.
Oh,
Um,
thanks.
I love, Jessica, how Fabscrap is addressing a unique component of the value chain and doing so in a way that's very tailored to that specific problem, right? These sort of swatches and smaller textiles, and of course, larger ones as well. As you will see if you ever go to their stores, it's incredible. Um, but do you ever think that like fashion in general, and fashion isn't like the big picture, like textile production and selling, lacks a clear sustainability direction? When whether some people are doing like I'm sustainable, whatever that means, I'm circular, whatever that
Yeah.
means, I'm compostable, recyclable, blah 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 blah. And as a result, like not really any, and maybe this is a targeted question, but like maybe no actual like no action is no strong result is being actually done because everyone's kind of running in different directions. And do you think that there should be, or what's your take on there being sort of like a more mandated role or goal within creating a more sustainable textile industry? What's your take on that?
I mean, I agree. I think that the industry is too big and there's too many layers in the supply chain for there to be real transparency.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so that means without the transparency, it's very hard for there to be accountability.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's difficult then to even define when impacts or changes have the effect that you are hoping.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so there's lots of brands who are trying lots of different things, but sometimes it's hard for them to even quantify the changes that they're making or how that has a trickle down effect. I think in general, it's hard for people to A, share what they're doing, and then B, have it quantified in a way where it is like transparent that there's been an effect or that there's something positive.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's still a lot of kind of secrecy. I think like there's still a little bit, I think because now sustainability is starting to be recognized as marketable. This isn't sort of like, hey, we've solved this piece, let's share it so the whole industry can be part of it.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me a little bit more where the trend is going is like, we've solved this piece and how we're doing it is proprietary because we want to be able to market that we've solved this
For
piece.
sure.
And I think there needs to be a little bit more collaboration,
Mm-hmm.
and the industry is so competitive and wants that exclusivity and wants
Mm-hmm.
that like marketing point
Mm-hmm.
that it's really hard for everybody running in all these different directions to track that, to share that, to evaluate that. And then even when there's claims, so many of them are very hard to back up and they don't want to share how it happened for all of these other reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I feel like it's almost impossible for an industry to regulate itself. I don't think that that is going to get us anywhere. I think there's some really um, there's some really good brands who I think care enough to act collectively, but I don't think it represents enough of the industry to like force all ships to rise.
Yeah.
Um, and that's unfortunate. And so that's where I think policy is really important. Later this month, I'm going to be in Albany lobbying for the Fashion Act.
Amazing.
The Fashion Act is one that I think kind of holds more companies accountable in a way that's fair across the board, but reaches a lot of different parts of the supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
And even though it's just something that would be passed in New York, because New York is kind of the fashion capital of the US, sorry, West Coast. If it's passed
Great.
in New York, if it's passed in New York and brands have to comply with these things to be able to sell in New York City, that actually has impacts that
Yeah.
if they have to comply to sell in New York City, they're going to just make those changes so they can sell everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of the way that like California has done with car emissions.
Yeah.
It forces everybody to comply across the board everywhere. So I think there's a lot of value in policy. I think it has to be legislation. Unfortunately, I wish it could be like collective agreements and collective targets and goals. I just anywhere in the climate movement, I just haven't really seen that be effective. I haven't
Hmm.
seen us hit any kind of target or goal on any kind of timeline that we've ever estimated. And so I think it's important that there be like consequences or teeth or penalties,
Hmm.
because the the carrot or like the prize, if we are able to make the changes, is too intangible for most people. It's too hard to say like, well, the prize is that like something's not destroyed.
Yeah.
Like that's
Yeah.
it's too intangible to imagine the not.
Hmm.
Um, and that's where I think consequences are probably the way that we'll have to go.
I guess piggybacking off of that, and more specifically to you and Fabscrap in general, are there any macro issues that you see preventing an organization like Fabscrap from scaling, or a system like yours that you've developed in maybe a different state or a different area or whatnot from scaling, right? This sort of take back system, this private nonprofit EPR system, as you've said.
Yeah.
What can you speak on that?
I mean, scaling's been what has been most difficult
Mm,
for us, and it's because we're nonprofit, and so we are kind of bootstrapping through each moment of growth, which makes it really difficult. We're not seeing venture funding where it's like, oh, you need to scale to be able to
sure.
handle this. Here's the money, scale and do it. Um, that's not possible the way that our organization is set up. So it means that we have to almost provide the service first and then we see the income. And
Mm,
so that's where grants and fundraising become so important for us, because for us to be able to scale to provide the service first, then the industry pays for it and now we have the income to keep going. But
mhm.
that initial jump up is always where it's either a lot of savings or we're doing things before we're ready or we have to fundraise. But I do think across the board, from what I've seen in New York City, if the city were to ban textile waste tomorrow, there's not an organization in the city that's ready to handle that volume. Um, I think that anything that rolls out needs a pretty long timeline, and it's going to need some government investment to be able to handle the volume of textile waste. Before I left the city, and granted, this was now 8 years ago, so it's been a while, and textile waste has only increased across the US. But when I left New York City's sanitation, we were picking up 250,000 pounds a month of used clothing and home goods. So a massive amount of material that we were picking up
Hundreds of tons.
was 250,000 pounds a month.
It's
Um, so that was 8 years ago. I think textile waste has only continued to increase since
Mhm.
then. There's not an organization that's ready to
Mm,
really accept all of the fabric waste in the city if people weren't still sending it to landfill. And so there needs to be a timeline for government support to be able to ramp up, to be able to scale up. I also think that's on the post consumer side. On the pre consumer side, there is a law that if your business waste is 10% or more textile, you're required to recycle it. But almost no businesses in the city know that law exists, and there's almost no enforcement of it. And even if they wanted to comply before Fabscrap, they couldn't. Fabscrap now is their only way to comply with that law.
mm.
So there needs to be some investment in the infrastructure for policy to work.
We're talking about the pre-consumer textile waste segment of the value chain. So again, clothes are being designed, products are being designed. That design phase creates a lot of waste. You're addressing that. What would you like to see happen after that when it comes to, they've already designed it in a better manner, which we've discussed. Now it comes into producing that product at scale. What are the big items that you want to see that segment of the value chain can change to, again,
Yeah.
create a better sustainable future?
I mean, one of the things that I think is really important is understanding that most clothing is still made by humans. I
Mm,
think there's a general feeling that like, oh, a machine made this, or it was like cranked out in mass. And most clothing is still made by someone with their hands on a sewing
Yeah.
machine, or in
Yeah.
some cases, like using needle and thread. And I think that piece needs more attention across the supply chain. Part of the
Mhm.
Fabric Act, too, is that there's still workers who are getting paid per garment. It's like piecework as opposed to paid per hour. And when you are considering how skilled this labor is to be able to make clothing of any kind, um, and that you're only paid per garment and it doesn't work out to even the minimum federal wage, it's I think that's where we need a lot of attention, is sort of on the production piece
Mhm.
and reforming that, not just overseas. Like, I know a lot of people think that this is an overseas issue, but this is even in California where
Mhm.
people are still being paid by the piece. And I think that needs a huge overhaul, and there need to be fair wages and more attention and credit given to the people who actually make our clothing.
Mhm.
And that's, people, that's a lot of brands, I think, say that it's too expensive to manufacture domestically. And that's part of the reason why. And I don't think the intention of the Fabric Act is that then people send all of their orders overseas.
Mhm.
I think part of this has to be that people want to see more domestic manufacturing, and that means paying more for that because you understand that someone needs to be paid for that
Mhm.
work.
I completely agree. I think reshoring manufacturing jobs is integral. I think leveraging new sustainable manufacturing practices can be done in a country like the U.S. And we should encourage that. However, that will, in our current system, result in a higher price per garment for the consumer side, and changing the culture of clothes as a disposable good to clothes as an investment piece or something of a higher
Yeah.
price good that you take care of will be a challenge. Is there anything that you would want to see consumers, any advice, any tidbits, any sort of info that you can share, or you'd like to see consumers change in their opinion towards the textile goods, that system of higher quality, better produced garments last longer is adopted by the masses?
I think that's a really, really hard shift
Mm-hmm.
because we have gotten used to like how disposable clothing is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we've become trained in that, like, this should only cost $10 because I'm only going to be able to wear it for one season.
Mm-hmm.
Like, um, I think it almost takes that first purchase to be like, oh, this is really nice. I can wear this next year. I can wear this the year after that. It almost takes like retraining that, like, you can have a wardrobe that lasts multiple seasons
Mm-hmm.
to understand the value that, like, oh, I don't have to go shopping again in 4 weeks. I don't
Yeah.
have to go spend more money. And I think that's just really hard with how quickly people move through their day to day life. I think one of the things that has accelerated that is influencer culture. And so that's something that I think has had kind of a devastating effect on how easily people feel like they can replace or restock or replenish clothing,
Mm-hmm.
and how often they can throw it away. OOTD, I think, was like the most horrible thing to get started, in that, like, this is my outfit of the day and they don't want to be seen wearing it ever
That's so
again.
funny.
So that single use
Yeah.
mentality is really
Yeah.
problematic.
Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I mean, as someone who works within the space and who supports a lot of creatives as you do, there is still something that's really human and beautiful about wanting to sort of leverage clothing as a sense of self-expression and
Yeah.
artistic, things. And um, I don't know, outfit of the day, what are people wearing type of content is encouraging of that sort of self-expression. And at the best, and at least I'll speak for myself as a very, very amateur pseudo person in that space. Like, we go to places like you and we take clothes and we upcycle them and we find, vintage pieces and we do something different
Yeah.
with them. And it's something that's beautiful. Like we're creators in that way. They're creators in that way. And um, I totally agree with you about the uphill battle that this will this change will have. This fast consumer visual and social media fueled sort of perspective on things is a net negative on sustainable consumption. But it's a fine line because we can't let people will naturally lean to wanting to create and express, and that
Oh yeah.
means making, unfortunately, and the systems of production are as what they are. But
And
you know,
I think
yeah.
like my appreciation for that has grown quite a bit because I
Mm,
see people create such incredible, beautiful things from
yeah,
from fabric that they get at Fabscrap.
yeah,
And so like I'm always so impressed with the creativity of people, but
hmm
that also makes me feel even more so that the like why would I go to I'm gonna like drop some names here, but this
do
is
it,
nothing against these brands, but
do
like
it,
a Gap or a J. Crew or an H&M, where I know a lot of people are going to be looking at and buying the same thing. And then I come to Fab Scrap and I see someone who like made something and it's one of a kind and it's beautiful and it's
yeah,
incredible. And like that, or people come and they found it vintage or they found it secondhand or they reworked something that they
hmm
found with Fab Scrap fabric, that like it almost reinforces for me that like the look at my Amazon haul is not the way that you
oh
have
God, yeah,
individuality. It's not the way you have style and
yeah,
self-expression.
yeah,
And so like that's it even more enforces like you can be so much more yourself when you're
yeah.
more thoughtful and intentional.
Absolutely, absolutely. On that point, Jessica, tell me about you as a person. Are you on your I know you're a mother now, you're a business owner. Are you do you enjoy upcycling things yourself? How do you engage with waste on a personal level?
I would say the place where I am most creative
Yeah,
is at Halloween.
of
I
course.
really, really get into hand making our Halloween costumes. I've done it for me and my husband for years.
Um,
This last year, I made a costume for like a family costume, but a costume for my daughter.
awesome.
So that's really where I get
Yeah,
most into it. Is my Halloween costumes are always upcycled,
I love
handmade.
that. I love that. Jessica, on this note, have you always wanted to be a founder of an organization?
No, no, no. Sorry to laugh at that question, but
It's
I just
okay.
did not ever in my life picture entrepreneurship.
Uh-huh.
Actually, when I was like young in New York City and I would like be out at a bar and a guy told me he was an entrepreneur, I used to think it meant he was unemployed. So
For the
like
record, that's not the case. That's not a fact
I
across the board.
No, it's not. It's not. I
Yeah,
just like really didn't like I didn't understand that like you could
that's
have
so funny.
a really successful, growing,
That's
thriving
so funny.
business. It seemed like statistically most
Sure.
did not.
Yeah, and it's true.
Um,
Most businesses do fail. Just put that out there. Yeah, and it's also a
um,
red flag if someone's like leading with like, "Oh, I'm an entrepreneur." Like putting that. But
as I
anyway.
found out, yes. And so like no, it took me a
Yeah,
long time to kind of claim that like founder entrepreneur title for
interesting.
myself.
Yeah.
I come from a family of like doctors and engineers, you know, the
Mm,
very like stable traditional career paths.
yeah.
And so even me moving into sustainability, my parents were like, there's no careers in that.
Wow.
So this would
Yeah.
now every company has their
Yeah.
sustainability officer and we're moving in that direction now, but
Yeah.
years and years ago not as popular.
I hear that. I hear that. Jessica, this wouldn't be a Growing Green Ventures podcast without me asking about some more personal components of the entrepreneur's journey. And I'm curious, as you mentioned, you pitched this idea in the onset on this TV show. You got the donations, you shifted to a nonprofit. But how did you tell me about the transition from professional waste management into this sort of startup organization? Did you fund it with your own money? Did you take out loans? And also, what did you do for health insurance when you left your organization to start this new entity?
All good questions.
Mhm.
So I had this idea for Fab Scrap for a while and I was kind of just working through it on the weekends while I
Yeah.
was at sanitation.
hmm
And then I had this opportunity to pitch it and originally told them no. I just didn't feel like ready yet. Like it
mm
wasn't solid enough in my mind. But they kind of like hounded me and I eventually said yes to the show.
Yeah.
And I felt really strongly about it. And so I actually gave my 2 weeks notice before I filmed. Um, so I
Whoa.
was like, if I'm gonna like really do this, like let's really do it. And I needed to know that like I kind of didn't need to have the like option B, you know, like I needed
Interesting.
all the eggs to move
Interesting. Okay.
into this basket and move forward in that direction.
hmm
And so Yeah, I pitched on the show. I thankfully got funding. We didn't see it right away, but I got funding. I had a big launch party when the show aired and like
Cool.
watched it with friends and people who knew what I
Yeah.
was doing. Um, then my boyfriend had given me $5,000 and he said, "This is for the business. I want you to do this. Like, we're going to do this." I found out later that was what he had been saving for our engagement ring. And so we got engaged later.
Oh, that's so sweet. I love
Yeah,
that.
really beautiful. It's just like,
Yeah, that's
um,
that's deeply beautiful, honestly.
yeah, just the belief in that we
Seriously.
could do it.
Yeah.
So that was the money that like allowed me to file the name, file the LLC, at least get all the formal, like get my website up, get my business cards
Yeah.
made. And then my parents contributed as well when I
Okay.
was first launching.
Yeah.
And then once the episode aired, I was open for donations. I could start signing up clients. And some of those first brands that I worked with at sanitation became clients right away.
Oh, cool.
So I didn't I didn't have a paycheck or pay anybody through the business for the first year.
Okay.
And I think that piece of entrepreneurship sometimes gets lost. It's not
Yeah.
like you can live off your business right away. It usually is
Mhm.
not the case. So I was a sustainability consultant for some other firms in the city, that I would do that at night and then do Fabscrap during the day.
Mm.
And that was how I made rent work and made my ends meet until I could take a small paycheck from Fabscrap in year two.
Mhm.
Um, and health insurance was just not existent until I got married, and then was on my husband's health insurance.
Gotcha.
Fabscrap offers health insurance now. Need to
Put
clarify
that
that.
out there for sure, for sure.
That was a big moment for me when I could offer that to employees.
Um, it's funny you said you laughed when you said you didn't want to be an entrepreneur or you weren't thinking about that, but what you just expressed is such a act of courage that is like the definition of entrepreneurship. And so kudos to you. And I mean, that's really an incredible story. Jessica, I appreciate you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. This has been, you're a body of knowledge, and I think that anyone that's listening to this is going to get something out of this conversation. I know I definitely have. All links to Fabscrap and the organization will be down below for all our listeners. But again, what you're doing is really important, and I want to thank you, not for myself, but for all of us collectively, because you serve as an inspiration to the sustainable fashion space in New York. For anyone that doesn't know, like I originally got introduced to Jessica and Fabscrap when I first moved to New York, and I went to some talk, and there was Jessica speaking about Fabscrap, and it was just very eye opening. And I know that that's not a unique story. A lot of people in this space, whether it be working at Remake or other organizations, I know feel the same. So it means a lot that you came on the show, and keep on doing the good work because the world needs it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for that. And thank you for having me. This was really fun.